we're going to hear from Dave Fairfield for his update on Feed and the Food Safety Modernization Act and the FDA. Dave is the Senior Vice President of Feed Services for NGFA. He joined the association in July 2001 after spending 20 years managing operations for commercial feed companies. As the Senior Vice President of Feed Services, he's NGFA's primary staff person that addresses food and food safety issues. Dave participates as a subject matter expert within a variety of food and feed safety forums, including the Association of American Feed Control Officials, Global Food Safety Initiative, and International Organization for Standardization. He also currently chairs the Animal Food Committee within the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, which develops and delivers educational and training materials to assist the animal food industry in complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Dave is a graduate of Kansas State University's Department of Grain Science in Manhattan, Kansas. So Dave, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the program. And we spent a lot of time over the last day or so talking about health and safety issues for employees. And so the focus of this presentation is a little bit different. We're going to talk about some of the requirements that relate to the safety of the food products that you handle through your operations, whether that be grain, animal feed, human food, whatever the case may be. So we'll get right to it. A little bit about my presentation. Supposed to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act, give an update on FDA activities. So I want to provide a little bit of a review about the rules that impact the grain and feed industry from an FDA perspective, specifically more related to the Food Safety Modernization Act. Talk a little bit about FDA inspectional activity that's been occurring, some of the focus areas. I want to go into a little bit more detail about specifically the sanitary transportation rule. That's probably a set of regulations that, from my perspective, I get the most questions about from this type of audience. Talk a little bit about what's next with FSMA, rulemaking, guidance documents, and then get into some common questions, and hopefully do all this by our 10 o'clock break, right? Okay, so a little bit of background about the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've been talking about this for a long time. It was signed into law in January of 2011, greatly expanded FDA's authority to regulate the U.S. food supply. It mandated that FDA create what they would call a prevention-orientated food safety system. If you're familiar with FDA's approach prior to FSMA, FDA officials would talk about their authority being reactive in nature. They would hear about a problem, or they would go out and inspect a facility, find a problem, and they would take reactive actions. And so what FSMA requires affected facilities to do is really establish processes and practices within their operations to prevent food safety problems from occurring. And so when FDA comes in to evaluate an operation, they're going to want to look at those practices, look at those programs that you have put in place, hopefully in compliance with the regulatory requirements, and take some sort of measurement or make some sort of evaluation as to whether those practices, programs are going to be effective in preventing food safety problems. FSMA was broader than just mandating new rules be created. It also provided FDA a number of new authorities. I'm not going to get into all those, but it was a very expansive rule. Another kind of broad perspective on FSMA, just as overview, there are four main components with the Food Safety Modernization Act. The prevention component that I just tried to comment on and articulate on. Inspections, compliance, and response was another key area. FSMA actually established mandated inspection intervals for facilities that need to register with FDA as a food facility. So if you're here today, I'm going to expect that you're probably obligated to register with FDA as a food facility, your operation is. And so FSMA actually established a mandated inspection frequency for your facility. For high-risk facilities, under FSMA terminology, that's every 3 years. For non-high-risk facilities, under FSMA terminology, that's every 5 years. And so I know after FSMA was enacted, a number of facilities within our membership who had never received an FDA inspection before had the opportunity to participate in one. And it was largely due to this inspectional mandate, the provisions within the law. Now, FDA likely looking back, FDA hasn't had the resources to conduct the number of inspections FSMA requires it to. Moving forward, FDA probably won't have the resources to conduct inspections at that type of frequency either, but they are going to continue to focus on what they believe are the greatest risks. And one of the risks that FDA puts in their risk ranking model is, if you haven't had an inspection for a number of years or never had an inspection, you become a high-risk facility. And that's why I believe a number of grain elevator operations within the NGFA membership who had never had an inspection before, again, had that opportunity to experience one since FSMA was enacted. Another key focus point within FSMA is import safety. That requires importers of foreign foods to take measures to ensure that the foreign food being imported reaches the same safety standards as food that's produced or distributed within the United States. And then finally, there's this enhanced partnership component to FSMA, kind of a buzzword within the regulatory world. We're going to build capacity by building partnerships, and so they have engaged in a variety of activities to work with state and local partners more than they had in the past to assure food safety. So one of the components of FSMA was these major FSMA rulemakings, and so what this slide does, it lists the big seven rules. That's FDA terminology relative to what FSMA required the agency to do. So we've got the current good manufacturing practice, or CGMP, and preventive controls rules for animal food. Animal food, that terminology was really introduced by FDA when they implemented FSMA. We used to talk about feed, but now we talk about animal food. So the two terms are synonymous, they're still in use, but FDA's preferred terminology is animal food. We've also got a CGMP and preventive controls rule for human food. We've got a produce safety standard. We've got the foreign supplier verification program rules. That's that import safety component related to FSMA. We've got the sanitary transportation of human and animal food rule, accredited third-party certification, and mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration. So those are the big seven rules. So anytime you're engaged in rulemaking or have rulemaking come at you, whether it be OSHA, whether it be FDA, whatever the agency, there are certain exemptions that are typically provided. And so, anytime there's a rule, you need to figure out, kind of who's in, who's out. And one way of looking at the FSMA rules, the big seven that I just went over, was which rules are applicable to animal food, which rules are not. And so depending upon your operation, this slide outlines those FSMA-related rules that could apply to your operations if you're involved in handling, in FDA terminology, it's manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding animal food. That's the terminology the FDA uses. So you can see those rules that potentially apply to your operations depending upon what you're doing. The animal food CGMP and preventive controls could apply. If you're an importer of foreign food, that FSVP rule would apply. The accredited third-party certification rule could apply again, and then sanitary transportation. And then those rules that are not applicable to animal food obviously would be the human food rule, the produce safety, and then the intentional adulteration rule is not focused on animal food facilities either. It's just solely focused on human food facilities. And the idea behind that rule was that FDA wanted to put in place requirements to hopefully mitigate the potential for terrorist types of attacks that could really have widespread harm to public health within the United States. And so FDA, during their evaluation of what kind of attacks could produce that kind of response, really reduce the confidence in the U.S. food supply, they determined that those types of attacks would occur on human food facilities rather than animal food, and so that rule does not apply to animal food. Another way of looking at these rules, in terms of who's in, who's out, who's covered, is the type of operation that you're involved with. And so this chart gives a very basic overview of the types of operations that may occur at a given facility and which FSMA rules could apply. This is a really broad brush look at this, and so don't take this as the gospel, but it provides some good direction in terms of what rules you ought to be looking at depending upon the type of operation you're involved with. I would want to point out here at this point that the type of operations performed at a single facility, that language is quite specific, and you need to understand what a facility means in FDA terminology. And one way to do that is to kind of consider a facility as being a legally defined piece of property in which food operations occur. And so that's kind of how FDA would define a facility. It's not just a given building, it's not just a given activity that's occurring, it's that piece of property where food-related activity is taking place. And so you could have potentially a variety of food-related operations that occur at a single facility, but FDA would view the requirements applying to all the operations at the food facility, not just a specific type of operation that may be occurring there. So if you're a grain elevator operator and the only thing that's occurring at your facility, kind of based on what I just tried to describe, is grain handling operations where you're bringing grain in and holding grain, you can see that of the major FSMA rules, really the sanitary transportation rule is the one that applies to you. And that's to my point earlier about getting questions about that rule. I think that's why, for my role anyway, I get a lot of questions about the sanitary transportation rule. If you had a grain elevator and a feed mill that are co-located at a single facility, you have the animal food CGMP rule and PC rule and the sanitary transportation rule that could apply. And it's not just that the animal food CGMP and PC rule applies to the feed mill, it also applies to the grain elevator because the requirements apply to the entire facility, not just that part of the operation that you might think it should apply. And so going on down this chart, you can see the feed mill, applicable rules, those are kind of obvious. And then if you're a grain processor who produces human food and animal food, you have the opportunity to get to comply with all those rules. So I've got listed on this slide. So let me switch gears and talk a little bit about inspections. During the past 18 months since COVID broke in March of 2020, FDA's inspectional activity has really been curtailed. The number of inspections that FDA has conducted has really dropped off. They focus on what they call to be mission-critical inspections. So if they receive a complaint about a food safety situation or there's an outbreak or there's some recall that's taking place, they'll certainly get out and perform an investigation in response to those type of activities. But routine surveillance activities by FDA during the pandemic have really been curtailed. But as we move out of the kind of the pandemic realm back to more normal conditions, we're going to see FDA activity ramp back up. And in the animal food space, if you have a facility that's subject to animal food rules, you probably already know that FDA traditionally will partner with state and local regulatory authorities to conduct about 80% of those types of inspections. And so while FDA in and of itself has really shut down its investigator activities, it's my perspective or what I'm seeing out in the industry is that state regulatory officials have been much more willing to get out and about and touch their regulated industry. And so I think we're going to see an increase in inspectional activity moving forward, both from an FDA standpoint and a state standpoint, or state credentialed standpoint. So FDA really has broad inspectional authority to go into food-related operations. So I think a focal point for our industry was FSMA. It kind of brought about a whole new set of requirements. It established an inspectional mandate for our facilities. As a whole, our industry has experienced more FDA inspections since FSMA was enacted. But FDA has had a lot of authority to come in and inspect our types of facilities for a long time, even before FSMA. And so this slide just lists some of those other requirements that you may need to be aware of that FDA has authority to come into your operation for and evaluate compliance. I'm not going to go through this list, but it's just highlights some of those requirements that were in place before FSMA, where if you have the opportunity to have an FDA investigator come in and look around, they're probably going to look at these different areas, depending upon what you're all involved with. So I just want to make that point. FDA has broad inspection authority. They can enter any really building, any vehicle associated with your operation, and inspect it at reasonable times, reasonable limits, reasonable manner. And that's really subjective language, and a lot of FDA's requirements are subjective in nature, And so it's through experiences and compliance activities that FDA conducts where our industry really kind of understands and learns what the words on the paper really mean in terms of the compliance expectations. So they've got broad authority to come in, inspect, to pull samples, to do a lot of different things. There's no warrant that's necessary for inspection. Typically, these inspections are unannounced. I do know that during the COVID time that we've been experiencing, FDA has reached out and provided advance notice on many of their inspections just so that the firm can be better prepared given the pandemic situations for the investigator. But that's not the typical practice, and we're going to transition away from that from an FDA standpoint moving forward. They typically are unannounced. Unlike OSHA, FDA typically does not impose monetary penalties. They do have civil penalty authority, but that's not often used, only in egregious situations. But instead, they will, depending upon the violations or observations they make, detain product from interstate commerce or distribution. They can mandate that firms recall products that are already in the marketplace. If the penalties or the violations are really significant, they can enter into consent decrees with firms requiring them to perform certain activities or agree to certain things to allow their operations to continue. And then one way, kind of the ultimate authority they have is they can suspend your food facility registration, which you all should have if you're involved in distributing or handling grain or food products. And once that registration is suspended, you can't distribute food. And so if you can't distribute food, you can't distribute grain, you can't do much. And so they ultimately do have that type of authority. If you want to learn more about FDA's inspectional activities, I wanted to provide you with a couple resources that you can look at. FDA has their transparency initiative going on, trying to be more transparent about what they're doing, their inspectional activities. And so this website, FDA data website dashboard, is one way to obtain more information about their compliance activities. And then if you want to really drill down and get detailed information, this is just a screenshot of a website and a URL link that would provide you that type of information if it's of interest. I just wanted to make you aware that information is available to you if you need to take a deep dive. A little bit about inspectional activity in the animal food space anyway. Here are some of the top citations that FDA has listed related to animal food compliance. If a firm is obligated to have a PC plan or preventive controls plan, you're probably aware that would require a written food safety plan. So if you don't have one, that's bad. Unfortunately, that's one of the observations that FDA is making when they go out and perform inspections, that firms don't even have a plan in place. That's not a good starting point for an inspection. Another thing related to your food safety plan, if you're familiar with it, you have to do a hazard analysis. And so what FDA is finding is what they believe to be finding is inadequate hazard analysis that are being conducted in conjunction with building a food safety plan. And then along with that, if you've got significant hazards that you've identified, you need to implement preventive controls to mitigate those hazards. And they're identifying failures to implement preventive controls in an effective manner. And then this is a little bit in the weeds, but a lot of firms who are required to have a food safety plan will rely on prerequisite programs to reduce the likelihood that a hazard is going to occur, to mitigate the need for preventive control. And so what FDA is finding or claiming or alleging is that a lot of these prerequisite plans that firms are relying on to deal with hazards are inadequate, or the implementation of those programs are inadequate. So those are some general findings that FDA has put out. On a more broader level, for our industry, general areas of concern, if you have an investigation, certainly housekeeping and sanitation practices are a focus. Pest control is a focus. Those aren't new. Control of mycotoxins is a focus. I mentioned during the pandemic, FDA's investigational activities has declined, so they've got extra money. They're not spending money focused on inspectional activities, and what they've done with a good portion of that money is they have embarked and engaged on a really robust sampling program within our industry. I hear from a lot of members that FDA and state credentialed investigators are pulling lots and lots of samples. And so when those samples are pulled, if they're susceptible to mycotoxins, you can expect that mycotoxins will be analyzed. And if there are levels of concern within those products, you'll hear about it from FDA. Another inspectional activity that they're focused on in general is nutrient deficiencies and toxicities. That's kind of for animal food facilities that are involved in manufacturing and formulating diets. You know, if you get too much of a certain nutrient in a diet, it can cause harm to an animal. Not enough can cause harm to the animal. That's a concern there. And then if you happen to be in the pet food space, essentially FDA views pet food as human food. And so there's a lot of focus there on pathogen control, whether that be Listeria or Salmonella or other pathogens. Let me switch over and talk more directly about the sanitary transportation rule. Again, that's a rule that I get a lot of questions on. If you remember look back at the little chart that I tried to describe to you, sanitary transportation rule would probably apply to all types of operations that are represented in this room. So let me do just a really high-level view of that rule for you. The rule establishes compliance obligations for 4 entities: shippers, loaders, carriers, and receivers. Those are all defined entities within the rule, and it places largely and predominantly most of the responsibilities on shippers, because FDA's view is that shippers have the greatest control over the transportation activities that occur. And so most of these responsibilities are targeted for shippers. So if you're covered by this rule, which I'm going to say you are if you transport grain or feed products by truck or rail. So here's just a broad overview of the requirements. First of all, assign responsibility for compliance with the rule to some responsible individual within your facilities. That's an actual requirement with the rule. So if you get an investigator who comes in and asks about it, tell them that you've assigned responsibility. Make sure that person that you've assigned responsibility to actually knows that as well. That'll be a good way to start the inspection. Second, shippers are required to establish in writing what constitutes acceptable conditions for the transportation conveyances that they're going to use to transport food. So I mentioned that there are 4 entities within the rule: shippers, loaders, carriers, receivers. Well, your facility could be one or more of those entities. You may be the person, the shipper, who arranges for transportation of the food, but you could also be loading that food. You could also be carrying that food, right? And so a single entity or single operation may fit one or more of these types of entities that are described within the rule. So a shipper needs to have in writing what constitutes acceptable design and sanitation conditions for transportation conveyances that they use. And depending upon their operations, they may need to communicate those conditions to the loaders of the food that they're arranging transportation for, and also the carriers of those foods. You also need to develop and implement written procedures to ensure that vehicles that are actually used for transportation meet those conditions. And again, those procedures need to be in writing, and they need to be communicated to other entities that have responsibility to carry out those procedures. It could be the loader if you're not the loader, it could be the carrier if you're not the carrier. So just make sure you've got those procedures in place and communicate those as appropriate and as necessary. If you're a loader of food, you need to follow the instructions that you receive from the shipper, right, that are supposed to tell you or inform you what conditions need to be present before you load food, bulk food onto that conveyance to assure sanitary transportation. So that needs to be an activity that loaders perform to evaluate whether those vehicles and transportation equipment meets those conditions. And then finally, the last thing I'll go over here, again, this is just a really broad brush description of the sanitary transportation rule. The rule really doesn't require many records to be established and maintained to demonstrate compliance. I mentioned some of those written procedures and written specifications that need to be developed. Surely those records need to be established and maintained, but you really don't need to document that you're following procedures. I think it's a good practice if you would choose to do so, but the rule doesn't require that in and of itself. And so these written procedures that we're talking about need to be kept for 12 months after those written procedures are mothballed or not used anymore within the operation. So that's a really broad brush for the sanitary transportation rule, some of the requirements. Just wanted to highlight those. What's next with FSMA? FDA is still engaged in rulemaking related to FSMA. It's remarkable that notice and comment rulemaking can take a long time, but it really does. Just in September of last year, FDA proposed a FSMA-related rule related to additional traceability requirements for certain types of food. My view on this rule, NGFA evaluated it, provided comment. I don't believe that our industry is going to be impacted. Animal food in general was not proposed to be under the rule, and I don't believe grain products, raw agricultural commodities like grains and oilseeds will be encompassed in the rule either. So we'll see how that moves forward, but again, rulemaking is still going on. Another rulemaking that we would anticipate happen yet this fiscal year ends in September 30th, 2021. We anticipate a notice of proposed rulemaking related to revisions to the food facility registration requirements, and more specifically, the farm definition. And my take on this initiative, based on my conversations with FDA, is that FDA is really looking for ways to broaden the farm definition, which would exempt more types of operations from FSMA-related requirements. And so hopefully that's going to be the direction that the FDA takes during the rulemaking. We'll see when they come out with their proposed rule. I did mention guidance documents. There are a number of guidance documents that FDA still needs to issue related to these final rules. I've listed some of those on this slide that we would anticipate coming out in the next 6 to 12 months. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was the idea of remote regulatory assessments. During COVID, FDA launched a number of program-specific related initiatives towards remote regulatory assessments. And the idea being that FDA wants to really reach out and touch the regulatory industry without having to visit your facility. And so these programs are essentially voluntary in nature, where FDA will contact a facility, ask them if they want to participate in this type of program, and if a facility agrees to do so, you're going to share information electronically with FDA so that they can evaluate that information in advance of an actual physical inspection and make determinations about the information you provide. The point I want to make here, I think, is the voluntary part of this. In general, FDA does not have authority to require its regulated facilities to provide electronic records. Typically, FDA only has access to records when they physically visit a facility. The exception to that would be the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule, in which FDA, under that rule, has legal authority to obtain electronic records from covered entities and evaluate those records. But by and large, FDA does not have regulatory authority to ask firms to share required records electronically. And so this would be a voluntary program that facilities would choose to become involved with, because they are hopefully going to maybe minimize the time the FDA investigator is going to be at the facility. You know, in the whole COVID environment, the idea was to, that was kind of a big selling point. It may be a selling point moving forward, too, in terms of industry participation. But FDA has rolled out a couple of pilot programs related to remote regulatory assessments. FDA's view on the pilots have been that they've been widely successful, and they want to expand this type of program into other areas. And so we're going to see that, I think, moving forward. Okay, let me wrap up here with some common questions that I get related to FDA. Maybe not your questions, but that I receive commonly. FDA requires a DUNS number for food facility registration. I can't get one. What do I do? I don't know if anybody here experienced that during the last registration cycle, but it's a common question. So the answer is, too bad, keep trying. FDA has actually issued enforcement guidance saying that during this facility registration period, which runs until 2022, they're going to use enforcement discretion and not require that every facility have a DUNS number. So if you haven't been able to get one, continue the effort to do so. Have one in place by the 2022 registration facility. Another question I get is, if an FDA investigator shows up at my facility, can I refuse entry or at least tell them to come back? You can do whatever you want to do, but like I said before, FDA doesn't need a warrant to visit your facility. If you refuse entry, I guess do that at your own peril, because FDA has broad authority to visit and inspect your facility. You can, if it is a really inconvenient time, you can ask the investigator to come back at a more opportune time, but the investigator's under no real obligation to honor that type of request. Another question I get, and this is kind of surprising to me that it continues to emerge, is does FSMA require the use of food-grade lubricants within my entire facility? I just had this question last week. And so the answer is no. FSMA, FDA, does not require the use of food-grade lubricants throughout your facility. FSMA did not change FDA's requirements associated with the use of lubricants. In general, food-grade lubricants are required if they're going to become a component of the food that you handle, or if it's likely that they're going to become a component of the food you handle. If it's unlikely that they're going to become a component, or if they're going to run into incidental contact, FDA doesn't require that you use food-grade lubricants. That's the short answer to that question. Another question I get still is, I operate a grain elevator. I've got a feed bag warehouse associated with that operation. Am I subject to the FSMA-related animal food CGMP and preventive control rule? And so this question kind of gets back to my earlier slide where I tried to define what a definition of a facility was, and FDA's view that requirements applied to the entire facility, not just aspects of the facility. So the answer to this question is, a facility that's solely engaged in holding and distributing grain is exempt from this rule, this animal food rule. However, if you've got a facility that's also conducting additional food-related activities, then the grain elevator becomes covered by those regulations or requirements that apply to those other food-related activities. So in this case, a bagged feed warehouse is covered by the CGMP part of the animal food rule. Therefore, the grain elevator operation that's at the same facility as this bagged feed warehouse is also covered by the CGMP part of the animal food rule. So maybe that's as clear as mud, but if you really want to know more about that, I can talk to you more about that later. Another question, are shippers required to know the identity of prior cargoes before shipping bulk foods? Gets back to the sanitary transportation rule. The answer to this is no. You don't need to know what was last hauled on the conveyance that you're going to use to load bulk food on. But the rule does require that you implement effective measures to assure that the prior load's not going to contaminate the food that you're going to haul. So you figure out the best way to do it. If knowing what the prior load is the best way, do that. If cleaning the conveyance is the best way, do that. But you're not technically under any obligation to know what was last hauled on the conveyance that you're going to use, not under this rule. Do trucks or containers transporting food under the sanitary transportation rule need to be sealed or locked during transportation? The answer to that is no. The sanitary transportation rule doesn't require that. And in fact, the intentional adulteration rule that I talked about, the FSMA-related intentional adulteration rule, doesn't require it either. Now, it certainly may be best practice for you to do that, but it's not a regulatory requirement. It's something that you need to work out within your own best practices. Then the final question I've listed here, because it's a topic that continues to come up, transloading stations. How do transloading stations fit into the whole FDA realm and world? What I mean by transloading station, you've got an operation that is receiving food from one conveyance and putting it on another conveyance for further transport to some sort of destination. So the answer, FDA excludes from food facility registration facilities that only hold food because they're part of transporting it from one location to another. So my view I'm not a lawyer. My view is that transloading operations are a transportation activity. You're only holding food because you're involved in a transportation activity. Therefore, you're not obligated, if that's the only thing happening at that facility, to register that facility as a food facility. So you're not obligated to comply with a lot of the FSMA-related rules that are triggered by food facility registration requirement. You would be subject to the sanitary transportation rule, though, because you're transporting food. Okay, let me just wrap up here with this resource. NGFA made available a pretty comprehensive guidance on FDA regulations that are applicable to our industry back in December of 2019. This resource is available to NGFA members. It's on our website if you can drill down and navigate it. If you're really interested in this and you're an NGFA member, feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to get it to you. It's not for the weak of heart. It's about an 80-page document, goes into some detail on the requirements. FDA regulations, like a lot of things, are complicated, and so we try to go into some detail and provide good explanation about how what the rules mean, how they're to be applied. So that resource is available to you. So with that, I know it's break time, but I appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Mark, Jess, I don't know what's next. Okay.
I've had 3 FSMA inspections this year already, and there's a discussion between the inspectors from 2 different states on a biosecurity plan. What is your recommendation on a biosecurity plan? Do we need to have one, or can that be part of our CGMPs?
So the question was, how does biosecurity fit into FDA's expectations related to food safety plans that you may be required to develop? So biosecurity normally relates to viral transmission of animal diseases. And so the big thing in that space right now is African swine fever. And so it's got a lot of trade press within the livestock sector and a lot of trade press about the ability for feed to be a potential vector to transmit African swine fever. So my take on that, and I have talked plenty with FDA about this, and so I think I'm providing kind of their perspective too, is that the whole viral transmission idea with feed is an emerging issue. And so right now, we kind of know it's out there. We don't know that much about it. We don't actually know what role feed has in transmission of diseases. We don't really know how to control it either. I mean, there are a lot of ideas that are out there, but there's a lot more science and information that needs to be obtained to fill gaps. So to try to directly answer your question, FDA does not have a regulatory compliance expectation that viruses be addressed within food safety plans. And I would almost go out on a limb and say that I would encourage firms not to include viruses within a hazard analysis that they perform for a written food safety plan, because we really don't know too much about those viruses and we really don't know much about controlling them, and it just adds FDA regulatory focus on that issue within an inspection where we don't really have many answers. So that would be my recommendation.
Just a real quick question. We store sugar beet pellets from the sugar beet industry. We bring them in, warehouse them, ship them back out. Would that be considered a transloader? We bring them in by rail or truck, ship them out by rail or truck.
If the only reason you're holding that product is to transload, yes. And I guess my second part of my answer caveat would be, is that the only operations that's occurring at that facility?
No, just a grain operation as well.
Well, so then no. You'd be since you've got a grain elevator there, you would need to register that facility as a food facility, and so you would be subject to the sanitary transportation rule.
But not facility rules, just the transportation rules.
Grain elevator, the sanitary transport rules. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, that's my non-consultant response. I don't have any legal ties to that answer. So.
It's all unofficial.
Yeah, it's unofficial.